All right. Welcome to another wonderful webinar with me here. The topic today is Agile and Flexible Mind during a pandemic. And boy, we all need it, don't we? So I hope you all are doing well. I hope you are flexible and agile yourself. And if not, I have some great strategies for you to think about, talk about, and maybe deploy. The way I do my training, the way I train the trainers, I often say that the work begins with you. So the first idea here is to do a self-check. And so I want us to be aware of what executive function is, what mental flexibility is, how does it connect to creativity, and then you can see a bigger picture. This is a conversation to be had over a long period of time. So I am going to do my best to cram everything in 1 hour. So here we go. So the first thinking is, of course, what is executive function? And you have heard me say this many, many times, but primarily it's a set of mental skills that we possess that allow us to pursue our goals with the thought processes that are essential, as well as with ideas and behaviors that go hand in hand. But executive function is not just a simple managing a goal, but it's also managing a vision for your life. So it has three major components or core components, and they include impulse control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. Since this presentation is not about the other two components, I'm going to concentrate everything on mental flexibility. So let's start with mental flexibility. So mental flexibility is described as the ability to refocus attention to relevant stimuli. The biggest challenge there is to determine what is most relevant in a given moment. So yes, if you have a dog that's playing in the room and you have work, then you can focus your attention on the dog because he's so adorable, but you also have work, which may not be adorable. So having to switch your mind to the right focus, with right focus on the right task requires cognitive flexibility. So I have this video which captures everything about cognitive flexibility and executive function. So here we go. Let's see if we can play this video. So what a great video, isn't it? What a pandemic relevant video. One thing that stands out in this for me is this child's flexibility, but incredible awareness of the environment and how readily and quickly he pays attention to that tiny puddle and shifts his focus from taking the dog for a walk to enjoying the puddle. So this is exactly what's also incredible here is that that child looks like barely 2 or 3 years old and is showing such finesse, such great skills that I think it will kind of put an adult to shame. But primary area here to focus on is that kind of keeping the big picture in mind, you're in pursuit of goals, and suddenly context changes. And based on the change in the context, you're changing your behavior. That's cognitive flexibility at its best. And it can be applied in such a jovial way to smelling the roses along the way or stop and smell the roses. That's exactly what this looks like. So it can also be applied to something bigger and something more critical or problematic. So the nature of cognitive flexibility is such that it allows you to pivot small or pivot big. So take this example of this woman who has locked herself or has some difficulty here, of course, getting out of the car because the door is jammed. So what should you do is your ability to think on your feet, to shift your attention as well as your approach. So one important thing in cognitive flexibility is there's an invisible component of the process that happens in the brain, and there's a visible component which you act out or plays out through your actions. So that's a great example of pivoting small, but it could be something pivoting big. So take example of Brian Stevenson. Those who have had a chance to read his book, Just Mercy, or seen the movie Just Mercy, know about his work. But he's an incredible human being who was working when he was in law school. He was working in Atlanta, Georgia, actually, at the Southern Center of Human Rights. And he took up a job of working on a project where he would interview the people who were on death row and find out if they were convicted wrongfully and how to offer them this solution to a problem that they were wrongfully convicted. So his work eventually panned into this one particular case, which was depicted in this movie, Just Mercy, but he freed this individual from death row sentence when before even he was on trial, he was referred to as a death row inmate. So that requires incredible pivoting. He was a Harvard graduate student in law. He had a very promising career. He chose to go to rural Alabama and take on this life with great hardship and opposition and all kinds of roadblocks, but he stuck with it. So that also requires engaging in mental flexibility over a long period of time. The next idea here to think about is that mental flexibility is not only critical, but it is incredibly pivotal to setting the child in the right direction, as well as adults who want to live a very robust life. So the greater the cognitive flexibility, greater the favorable outcomes. And research shows that these favorable outcomes range from simple things as reading comprehension, to taking better decisions, to being able to generate a lot of creative solutions for self as well as for the world. So how does this look or apply to real life? So one important thing that cognitive flexibility comes into play is when you run into a problem. So take example of this young boy. He's so delighted that he has a ice cream cone and he's about to take a bite, and plop, it falls to the ground. Now, a couple of things need to happen. One, you can completely freeze. You can be completely annoyed. You can be saddened, or you say, what do I do? So that pause is when the shift can begin to happen. So that requires incredible self-awareness, and it requires situational awareness. So are you aware that you are in the midst of a problem? So many times people actually have struggled with mental flexibility because they're not even aware that they're experiencing a problem. The problem is prolongs for a long period of time, and then people become aware and say, oh, I need to do something. So the gap between when the problem occurs and the time when you become aware, when you shorten, that's when you're going to have the most productive life. So those who do not become aware are the ones who suffer the most. And they may not even be failing to pivot, but they may not have thought about the problem long enough. So I love to think about shifting perspective in this picture or in this slide, as you can see, that now the beginning of the problem solving is at the point when the ice cream cone is on the floor. So now the question you should be asking to yourself, I have two choices. One, go get another cone and fill it up with the same scoop of ice cream that I had, or I can maintain my mindset and smile and walk away. So if you don't have money or you don't have access to, let's say it was an ice cream truck, and then you got your ice cream and then it fell, but the ice cream truck is gone, you do not even have that second choice. So the mental flexibility is to look at your options and activate which option looks appropriate, timely, and how to come to terms with the option limitedness of the option. So that also requires mental flexibility. So there's one more concept that I want you to think about as you try and understand mental flexibility, that there's something called theory of mind. So there is an affective theory of mind and there is a cognitive theory of mind, which means a theory of mind is the concept that understanding that other people have thoughts, beliefs, ideas, and desires that are very different from yours. You also have thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and you are pursuing some goals, they are pursuing their goals. But if you're blind to the thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and desires others have, then you may be selfish, Or you may be self-centered, or you may be unenlightened, selfish person. That means you're not trying to cause any harm to other people, but you're just not thinking about others. Now, this is a very important part in mental flexibility, because you can activate your mental flexibility by thinking about other people's thinking. So let's take an example, take a look at this video.
Good afternoon, madam.
Yeah, I'm sorry, officer.
Can I see your papers, please? Hello. Mummy in a bit of a hurry, was she? Step out of the car, madam! Step out of the vehicle now!
Now, what I love about this video is the tease in that little girl's eyes. I hope you all got it, that she is playing. She is being mischievous, right? So there's a moment in the beginning of the video when she says, "That's not my mommy." You begin to wonder that, is she being kidnapped? Then she holds the sign that says, "Help." You are continuing with that thought. But now, when she looks directly at the camera and smiles in a smug way, you know she doesn't mean it. And this idea that you're thinking what the officer is thinking, you're thinking what the girl is thinking, you're thinking what the mom is thinking, and then you have to think about everybody's thinking, is that theory of mind. So this theory of mind is another very critical component that builds cognitive flexibility. So children and adults with autism and Asperger's or spectrum disorders have this real genuine struggle that they're not either able to activate perspectives of the other, or they're not able to hold on to the perspectives of others simultaneously and think about other people's thinking. And that can create a great handicap, because all what we do in a social context is pivot. Pivot small, pivot big. Why? Because we are reading the minds of others. If a man's girlfriend comes and say, "Do I look fat?" He has to now think about not her fatness, but what is she thinking, right? If she doesn't want to be that you thinking that she's fat, then your answer as a boyfriend would be, "Honey, you're perfect," right? So let's think about this idea, then applying that. What are you moving back and forth from? Because if we think flexibility, just like a muscle flexibility, you're moving from one perspective to another. So let's say that the first perspective shift that needs to happen is you shifting your own perspective from one perspective to another perspective. So when does this apply? Let's say you go to the library and your plans are to study, and you go to the library, open your computer, and boom, the battery is 3%. And then you open your backpack and see there's nothing. You don't have a charger. Now you have to think from your own perspective as a person who arrived at the library to work, and the other person who doesn't want to get into the snow to go back to the dorm room or go back home by driving. So now you have to shift the perspective of what the bigger goal is. And sometimes we're not so good at knowing what the bigger goal is. And so we become victims of our own shoddy thinking. The second ways to think about moving back and forth is taking a perspective of self and taking the perspective of the other. Now, the other can be an individual, it can be family, but more importantly, it can be culture. And this other perspective is incredibly invisible. And that invisible perspective has an incredible role to play in your life. So for example, I am from India, and in India, showing respect to elderly is a huge, important cultural norm. So if you meet your grandmother after many months, you are going to take blessings by touching her feet. Now, if you're not from India, and if you are along with Indian, so my children actually went to India with their friends who are Americans, and they saw my children do that, you adhere to that new rule because you're taking a perspective of what the grandmother might be expecting. So this kind of way of shifting between perspectives makes us flexible, but it also makes us collaborative. It makes us very congenial. It makes us decent human beings. Now, the next thing to think about, social cognition, or the science of thinking about social world or interconnectedness, happens through these shifts that we make, shifting between your own perspectives and shifting between yours and other people's perspectives, and then shifting between you and many, many other people's perspectives. So, by the way, all that requires incredible working memory. So if you don't have big working memory, this can be a huge problem. People with ADHD, people with anxiety disorder, people with depression, people with any type of mental disorder that has impact in one's ability to pay attention and maintain these stream of thoughts, can struggle with working memory and not be able to take or activate perspectives. And that is one of the reasons one may be rigid. The next important aspect to think about is, don't you love this sign? What happens in vagueness stays in vagueness. So this is the idea of ambiguity. Lots and lots of life's issues are ambiguous. And ambiguous is the gray. So not having clarity, not having resolution, not having a right or wrong requires you to hold on to many perspectives of things not working out, or things not going the way you wanted. And those who are very effective and successful in managing the vagueness tend to do better with their flexibility. So take a look at this, another video. Very cute. So as you can see, there was a moment. So if I use this video for therapy, one of the things I would ask my client, what was the pivotal point where the person misunderstood? And so this particular gesture of him stretching against the car, also from far away or from nearby, gave an impression he was trying to shove the car off the cliff. And this ambiguity or vagueness can cause interpretation. Now, what this man, the truck driver, did not do is, that's why he was concrete, is he did not put that in the context. So the context is, the man is in jogging suit, the man has a nice expensive sports car, the man could be, man is sweaty. Now that the man is sweaty could be because he's struggling to push the car off. But what other possibilities exist? That is the reason the man is trying to push the car or pushing against the car. So one of the reasons I'm using this example is for us to think about that sometimes we are too quick to jump to conclusions and not activate all the other possibilities, or we are not good at contextualizing an observation. And if you don't contextualize it, then you can be very rigid. So let's think about this. Benefits of mental flexibility, tons of them. As I mentioned, reading ability in childhood, also higher level of creativity, greater resilience, and better quality of life in general. Because you know what? One of the most important components of wellness is letting things roll off your shoulder. Guess what? Letting things roll off your shoulder is nothing but cognitive flexibility. So now let's switch to creativity. So if you think about rigidity, to the other spectrum is creativity. So creativity is to be able to think in outside the box. So I like to tell my clients that thinking outside the box requires a box. If you don't have a box, then you don't have thinking outside the box. So what is the box? Box is developing some norms for yourself to understand what's expected, what's normal, and more life experience you have, then greater and greater opportunity you have to understand what the box is. And only then you can think outside the box. So this is a great pandemic example, creativity at its best. This is a particular, these are mannequins dressed in 1940s style attire. And this is in a little, this is called the Inn at Little Washington, and it's in Virginia or near Washington, D.C. area. And they decided to reopen, but they have a very large dining area and a beautiful inn. So in order to maintain the social distance, but yet give this flair of fully occupied restaurant, they decided to place mannequins in this beautifully dressed way. So this is a take on a pandemic. When done well, it really brings joy or a little smile on your face. So now let's think quickly about the barriers to flexibility. And so there's a natural wiring in the brain that doesn't allow you to be flexible. So I want you to understand that brain, as much as elastic it is, it's also rigid. So you might be victim of your brain's rigidity. So let's think about that. So for example, one is our visual system. It has a lot of, we often fall prey to illusions, and not just illusions that a magician brings, but our brain is very good at creating illusions. So this is an example of a visual illusion that I'm going to share with you. But before I talk about that, let's think about this idea that we are quite critical of other people, and we are quite generous towards ourselves, because we are unable to see the things that others are clearly able to see in us. But because we are clearly able to see what other people do, we carry that belief that our view of ourselves is as pure and as clear, but it's not. So let's take example of these two parallel lines. Agreed? There are two red parallel lines. Perfect. Now, this is an illusion. So this is particular, it's called Hering's illusion. And here, these two red lines stop appearing parallel. You see the little bend? Yeah. So this bend is because of the lines behind it. And how much ever you try, your brain, the cerebral brain says, yes, these were parallel lines, but your eyes keep informing the brain, no, I'm seeing a curve. Sorry, man, it's not really parallel. So now it creates a confusion or a distortion of some sort. So this common problem of this Hering illusion is commonly seen in real life, where the angular displacement causes us to stop seeing lines from being parallel. Now, how brilliant is that? Because this was already understood many years ago. And this is the Pantheon in Greece. We actually visited it. And this appearance of all these pillars being straight and parallel and perfectly placed is an illusion. Because there was an architect who was summoned to go to Greece and figure out how is actually all this constructed. So then they found this incredible secret that, as you can see the image on the left, that the Pantheon as it appears, and the middle it's the optical refinement is how we are able to actually. Because the curvature built in to the Pantheon, we are able to see the image as if it was on the left. But if the Pantheon on the right, you can see that how it would appear if there were no optical refinements placed. Bottom line, I'm telling you that our brain, our eyes, our perceptive system is designed to create and craft many illusions. So to see through them, see beyond these illusions requires incredible humility and incredible patience with yourself, and an assumption to self by saying, what if I'm not getting it right? So that's a great thing to start to begin with. So what happens if you're rigid and inflexible? Well, several things happen. You are unwilling to change your routines. You are stumped by unanticipated roadblocks. There is a reluctance to accept feedback or criticism. You are argumentative, or you are resistant to change. You're just oppositional. Have you seen, my children and I are obsessed about House these days. So we've been watching House, and he's just a difficult person. Getting cooperation requires incredible cognitive flexibility, and to cooperate with other people demonstrates incredible flexibility. So those of you who are listening, who are parents and teachers, you know a rigidity at its worst is this unwillingness on the patient, on the client's or the child's part, that they're not willing to work with you. And then it becomes really difficult situation. And finally, a real handicap that a rigidity causes is failure to troubleshoot, and let alone adapting to the larger challenges of life, but just troubleshoot. I had once a client that I worked with who had a final history paper, and he was asked by the professor to turn it in on Friday, and in my office. So my client showed up. He tried to open the handle, the door was locked. So he turned around and he went home. He never slid the paper under the professor's door. He never wrote a note, he never called, he never emailed. He took one path, and that path was adequate. So if the path doesn't lead to goal achievement, then it's really not a path completed, right? But it was not kind of apparent to him in that moment. So now a few other ideas to think about. The social emotional rigidity can be extremely expensive. You are not able to shift between your own perspective, why you should reconcile, why you should say sorry, why you should kind of really give compliments to somebody, why you should not be so jealous. All these skills require incredible cognitive flexibility. And that flexibility, when activated, you are much more spiritually generous towards the others, and you're less self-critical. So if you find yourself being self-critical, then you can certainly suspect that there's some rigidity going on there. So let's see this in action. Another quick video.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are two people.
You get the picture. So this is another example of rigidity at its best. So if you can see, one very obvious shift that these two people have not made is thinking about, they are comparing escalator with an elevator, and that's when they have gotten stuck. You know, when you're stranded in an elevator, you just wait for the elevator to activate itself. And so one, not checking with the context. So I'm just kind of setting the stage for how to handle rigidity or how to become more flexible. Always check in with the context and look for the context clues. They're not doing that. And second is there is also not connecting with the goal. So what's the goal? If you think about it, if you're on an escalator, your goal is to go up. And the going up can be attained by walking, climbing, jumping. So if you don't think about what the goal is, reconnecting with the goal can be a great way to start problem solving when you are experiencing some problems or encountering inflexibility. So let's think about let's think about some challenges that people experience when you have diagnosable disorders. And I want to invite all of the listeners here to think that you don't need a special mental disorder to have flexibility challenges. Inflexibility is a hallmark of youth or younger generation, as brain is less mature. So a 10-year-old is less flexible than a 16-year-old, and a 25-year-old is more flexible than a 16-year-old. But the idea is, if you compare all the 16-year-olds, if you are less flexible and rigid, then you are going to bear the cost of your own rigidity. And at its best, I can describe that the cost of inflexibility is people going away from you. Nobody wants to be with somebody who's just difficult to deal with. I rather have difficulties, but not be difficult to deal with. So I'm inviting you all to think about this idea that you can have a lot of problems, but your problems are no problem because you're open to accepting your problems and open to sharing that you have problems. And that seems to be the kind of a unveiling of a learning disability. At least my 20 years of work tells me that. So let's think about sticky thoughts. This is a characteristic of depression and anxiety disorder. And actually research shows that there is a greater inability to switch sets when there is mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, and OCD. So with all that now, let's think about what are we trying to accomplish? We are now trying to accomplish transcendence. So we don't want to just become flexible, but we want to kind of enter this. I like to think about, there was a McKinsey, I read somewhere that McKinsey Consulting, when they have an interview, they had people come in and they made people sit for an interview, and they asked them to close their eyes and say, imagine you are in a room completely dark and there's no light switch. What do you see? How do you get out? So one person said, well, I'm imagining that I am on a prairie and there is no need for a light switch because all I have to do is walk a little bit further and I am going to come to an opening and I can see far better because of the moonlight. So this ability to kind of externally limiting factors, kind of blowing them out of your horizon is what flexibility training is all about. So let's think about how can we gain that mental muscle that makes you flexible. So I have broken that down into 3 parts. So let's start with the first part, which is building critical thinking skills. So this complex and abstract thinking is really essential ingredient for building cognitive flexibility. So number 1 is hypothesizing. I think it's a terrible suggestion to give people suggestions when they're in crisis. Nobody does good thinking in crisis. So if you're supporting, helping, just help. Don't engage them in hypothesizing. What will happen if you do this? What will happen if you do that? Don't do it. Hypothesizing needs to be done when you have no stress. So an ideal situation is when you're chilling and let's say you're getting ready for an interview. It is much harder to problem solve during the interview than night before as you're role playing with your friend for an interview. So why? Because hypothesizing requires you to generate alternatives, and it's like a bottleneck effect. If you don't have stress, then the bottleneck is open, you can think more freely. So imagine what will happen, and I'll tell you a quick story of a client of mine. This is 20 years ago. This client had a concussion. He was thrown off a motorbike and had a concussion. He had fracture in many places. He had his leg in a sling. His head, there was a halo. I walk in with a test. It's called ROS Information Processing Test. And the first item on the test is, so I take my piece of paper I had, and I was taking notes, and I say, so young man, imagine you're driving on a highway at 95 miles an hour. That was the setup of the question. And this man looks at me and says, lady, are you blind? I can't even walk. So the idea there was, this was a hypothetical situation to get him to do some problem solving so I could guess or gauge his problem solving ability. But no, he couldn't even understand that this was a hypothetical situation. So hypothesizing is a good first step. And this is something you can do in writing journaling about different options is a really good idea. This also serves 2 purposes. That what if scenario, you can write down your anxieties, particularly if you're about to take a decision, such as buying a car or traveling in this pandemic. You might want to think about what if something goes wrong. Then you can write it down. And then once you have some opportunity to write some alternatives or think through, as I mentioned earlier, compromised working memory is one of the biggest reasons why people are not able to generate many alternatives, because they cannot hold on to them. So it's a good idea to write and then do this hypothesizing process. Then the last strategy in this hypothesizing is at the most. Saying these things such as, at the most, I won't get the job. At the most, I will be late. At the most, I will have to turn down the offer. So once you know what the worst scenario looks like, you can actually have some smaller steps that are the pain of those attaining those steps is less severe than the one option where nothing is going to work out. The next thing to think about is adjust and repurpose. So one story comes to mind is of this young man in Pembroke Salon. He's the owner, and a robber came. And he had a mask and a gun, and he pointed, and the owner was curling a woman's hair, and he suddenly turned the hot rod towards the gunman and knocked his pistol and pinned him to the ground. So this repurposing is a really important step. That means a curling iron is good for curling iron. It can also be good for maybe threatening the robber to go away. So this ability to think on your feet requires incredible repurposing of an idea or or thing that already exists. And that again requires a very large cognitive repertoire, so to speak, a network in the brain where a word is associated with another word because of the shared characteristics. And there are exercises that can be done to enhance this ability. The next thing is really focus on language play and literature. There is one single thing that the literature does is allows you to imagine that your own imagination may not have the capacity to know it can imagine. So let's say if you ask a rich man, what would it be to be like a poor man, he's going to now imagine the poorest person he knows, which may be his butler. But if you ask the butler, who is the poorest man, he may be thinking about the homeless man that he encountered on the street. So if you don't have a global view or perspective, your imagination is limited. That's why we read. That's why we inform ourselves by the stories of others, because it gives us a perspective, a viable option of leading a life that is completely different than your own. So there's another thing that in my practice, or a lot of speech and language pathologists, we do a lot of work on expanding linguistic competence, that the wordplay, idioms, metaphors, understanding the implicit, all these aspects that are driven by language and the double meaning and entendre can really empower a person to understand that many things can be conveyed by a twist or an emphasis, that I can use the word really in 5 different ways, conveying 5 different meanings. Really? 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 Now, what I'm saying to you is understood between you and I based on my inflection. Now, this inflection is an experience that can be induced by understanding of language in cultural context or social context, what we call pragmatics. So next thing is my children, when they were younger, my favorite book was Amelia Bedelia. This is one thing that I use in my work, not Amelia Bedelia, but something like that. But if those who know this already know, Amelia Bedelia is a queen of concreteness, and her interpretation of things always gets her in trouble. This is a very good start for young children, but by the time the children are teens and young adults, language play needs to be really expounded upon. And I really think that puzzles can really do a lot of growth through like learning to solve puzzles, and wordplay can be really be a spectacular tool. Now, it's not everybody's favorite, and everybody is not gifted in the domain of language, but just having practice is really important. And I say to kids, one of my favorite books is Hatchet that I've used that for high school and elementary kids as well. Why? Because it does lots of things with the story as well as the characters. You can take a slice of an exchange between people, and you can build this understanding of what is the other person thinking, what are you thinking about their thinking, and you can also think about, was there any other option to do things? So these are some recommendations, but one thing that I'm trying to say to you, that use literature to transcend your surroundings. And guess who did this best? Abe Lincoln, one of my favorite presidents. I'm obsessed with Abe Lincoln. Currently, I'm reading his 3rd biography. Apparently, he has 30 biographies. So no, I haven't read all of them, but why? When he was young, I just put that there. I think he was born in 1809, and in his childhood, first of all, when they lived in Virginia, they did not have much of anything. When they moved to Indiana and his mother died and his stepmother came, she brought a Bible with her. That was his first book that he got exposed to. And then eventually the surroundings were so limited that he didn't have access to lots and lots of books. But these were 4 influential books that he often talks about that taught him a lot about life. And what he did, he read them, and guess what? He reread them. And then what he did? Reread them. And eventually he memorized them. And then eventually he moved on to Shakespeare. But in his writing, you can see the influence of language as well as the early moral stories that tell people's beliefs, people's principles, people's incredible unwillingness to compromise for the greater good. Everything can be accomplished through language. Next thing is be willing to change your mind. This is really important. This is a precursor to admitting you are wrong or you are not that great as you thought. But if you have this narrative story that you tell yourself that I am unpenetrable, I am fabulous, then you are going to have a very hard time in exercising flexibility. And then what's going to happen is you are going to stick to the story without changing yourself. And I love this particular, this is a Steve Martin tells this story that when he was a stand-up comic, and eventually he became a screenwriter and then producer, and then he acted in his films. He gained a lot of success. And one such movie had just been released. It was under the comedy section, and it wasn't doing that great. And he thought to himself, why is that not doing so great? So he went and saw the movie in the theater, and people were rolling. Like he calculated, like he says, there were 30 laughs during the whole movie. Then he went to another theater where a competitor's movie was playing. And he said, I sat there, only 3 laughs. And still that was a blockbuster hit. And he said that at that time, I realized people also like stories. So he realized that his funny movie did not have a story that bound everything together. So this willingness and openness to rethink the problem rather than the solution. Maybe like one thing could happen is you hate the other movie, you can hate the person who wrote the movie, you start self-blame and say, I hate myself for writing such a bad movie. He said, maybe I'm not thinking about the problem in the right way. And when he starts saying, what do people like to see when they go for movies, he realized, they like to see good stories. So rethinking of the problem can be incredibly helpful as well. The next thing to think about is, a great example is Doris Kerns Goodwin. She is known as the presidential biographer. She tells this story that when she was at Harvard Law School, I think, a bunch of like 16 people were selected to be White House fellows. And LBJ invited her to be his personal fellow, I guess. And turns out at the same time, she was also a rebel. She was anti-war, and she wrote a paper, which is how to remove LBJ from the office, from the White House. And this paper, LBJ offered her the job. 2 days later, this paper was published. And then she says to herself, oh boy, there's no way I'm going to get this job. And because who wants to hear somebody criticizing you? And then she got a call, and guess what LBJ said? I love this. He said, you know what? Oh, bring her down here for a year or so. If I can't win her over, no one can. That requires incredible openness and not perceive criticism as threat to your existence, but recognize that there's something that other person has seen that can be valuable feedback for me to change. So developing a relationship with criticism is an important way of developing cognitive flexibility. Next is be willing to change yourself. And that changing yourself requires an incredible understanding of your strengths and weaknesses. I have designed this software called ExQ. And one thing that I have taken the trouble, or I'm deeply committed to disclosing to every student what their strengths and weaknesses are. Why? Because I feel that's the beginning, the first step. You cannot change yourself if you don't know what to change about yourself. So that's a really important point. So one thing that you can do is ask people to give feedback and create a constructive narrative. So you can go around, and this requires a little emotional courage, I grant you that, but you can say, okay, Sarah, I know you love me. Tell me what I'm really good at. And then Sarah tells you what you're good at. Tell me one thing I can improve. And Sarah is like, no, you're perfect. I know, I appreciate how deeply you respect me and love me. But there's one thing I can accentuate about myself. Well, you could start coming on time. Well, thanks, Sarah. Am I late all the time? So defensiveness needs to go down when you're dealing with your feedback that you get from people. But I love this story that Steve Martin tells, which is a taking a long view. This idea that you have when you are thinking about self, don't define self as a narrow a 1 point and 2020 me, but think about when I look back in 2032, what would I be seeing in myself? He says he was in 60s, he was a young comic, and he used to wear this turquoise jewelry. He had long hair, beard, shaggy clothes. And he said, I used to perform all over. And I took a minute, I paused, and I said to myself, this looks like it's going to end. So instead of becoming part of something that is going to die, why not I join something that's going to start? So in this decade, as he was entering into 70s, he completely overhauled his look. He cut his hair, he clean shaved, he started wearing a double-breasted suit, and he started showing up impeccably dressed. And suddenly his comic act changed. When I work with my clients, I often talk to them about their image and kind of conceptualize, like doing an image board. What is, if everything was going well, what would that look like? Who would you be? How would you dress? What would you say? What will be your favorite thing? Now what you're doing is, instead of describing yourself stagnant ways of today's you start thinking about bridging the gap between tomorrow's you and today's you. And that is a fantastic way to take a long view of your own life. It's like almost like taking a decade after decade, in what ways I want to change. The next thing to think about is regulate and redirect your emotions. This is a really hard ways to build cognitive flexibility, because this requires you to understand your own emotions. And sometimes if you're working with children, they may not know what they're feeling, and they may need labels. They may need to understand these emotions are something that happens to them, but they are not it. And this distinction requires therapy, as you can understand. So the most important thing here is let go the goal that you might have temporarily, so that you can manage your emotions. So this letting go is an important step, act of flexibility, of course. You can also use some self-guiding prompts, such as, what's my plan B? This may or may not work out. What's my plan B? How do I feel about plan B? And I often, even in my sessions, what I do is have clients come up with 3 plans and ask them to start with plan C. And this is a really painful process, because plan A is your best plan. So not to execute your best plan can be quite tedious, because your plan B and C are not that stellar, but experiencing that rough ride is really important experience for flexibility. The next thing is this amazing idea of first-rate temperament. I don't know if you know, this is Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was the Supreme Court Justice during the times of FDR. When FDR became president, he scheduled a visit and went to meet him. And he's legendarily known to say that FDR is second-rate intellect, but first-rate temperament. Now, this is a really bad insult to his intellect, because he was incredibly smart. But the essence here is that first-rate temperament is having incredible emotional intelligence. And this emotional intelligence can be cultivated by connecting and recognizing that body and brain are connected. They're not separate. If you control or connect with your body, the sensations you have, you're going to understand when your temperament flares up, when your heart is palpitating, you're not feeling anchored. And there are some tools and methods you can do to anchor yourself. Breathe in, calm down, and then regulate kind of revisit your goals, and maybe repurpose some of the skills that you already have to meet the goals that you have. And lastly, in this really temperament issue is, there was I forget now where I read, but there was a discussion, a very famous person was asked, what do you contribute your success to? And they said it was luck. And I have heard that again and again. Luck, to contribute your success to luck, shows your humility, also shows that you cannot control and manage every aspect of outcomes. Some outcomes are not going to work out for you, and that requires some sort of letting go and emotional flexibility. Another strategy I want to share with you is this idea of big deal and little deal. Every juncture of your life, you face this option to evaluate and say, is this a big deal? Or it can be a little deal. So if it's a little deal, having to lose your parent, let's say, is a big deal. But getting a flat tire, is it really a big deal or a little deal? And then eventually you develop this notion that everything can be a little deal. And if it is a little deal, then why fuss? Why worry so much about it? Then think about building healthy relationships with failures, which I talked about. A failure is accepting personal folly, but failure also accepting the faux pas or inherent nature of effort. When you put effort, some effort is not going to work out, and be okay with it. I don't have time to go into depth, but this is a topic for itself. And you can share, and by the way, in comments, if you have any recommendations that you would like to hear more about, I'm happy to think about that topic. But walk a mile in someone else's shoe. This is another social emotional experience that you need to have. Lincoln was a fantastic orator, as you know. He was known to, one time he was on the podium and he started his oration, people were applauding, and his opponent was sitting on the stage and he began to berate him. And the laughter turned into a roar. He was really riding a wave of ecstasy that I'm so fabulous, I am winning. And then his eyes turned to the gentleman that he was berating, and he was crying. And watching that, Lincoln, when he stepped down, he apologized to his opponent and he vowed that he will never do that again. So that understanding that winning is not as important than making sure other people are well. And that perspective requires a lot of flexibility. And that brings me to this idea of worst case scenario, again, kind of thinking about what will be the undesirable outcome that you're trying to avoid so desperately. So maybe accepting and saying, oh, well, maybe that was one of the things that is likely to happen. So now as we come to the end of this conversation, I'm going to give you the last part, which is shake up the routine. So there is executive function has a very important component called motor mechanics. That means everything cannot be in your head. You have to do. So some practice simply needs to be about practicing. So if you are folding clothes, practice 10 different ways to fold faster. If you are cooking, practice cooking the same dish 10 different ways, because your proficiency and flexibility can develop after knowing how to do basic things. I love the show Chopped. One of the reasons I love it, because what do? They present ingredients that are not typical. Only very highly experienced chefs can take a typical ingredient and say, they touch it, feel it, smell it, and say, this is like a raw jackfruit. I know what to do with raw jackfruit. I know nothing about this particular food item. I'm going to make everything I do with the raw jackfruit. So this ability to adapt requires kind of shaking up routines. So one, as a family, keep the routine and then mix it up. Those who wake up every day at the same time, wake up early. Those who eat dinner at the same time, eat dinner slightly early or late. Why? Because this is one of the antidotes for rigidity and stiffness of mind. Next is unexpected swap. You can create, and I've played this game with my clients, you already create like, what will the rule be? So rule is already decided, but that rule is applied to different situations. So everybody orders something, and then you put your hand in the bowl where the rules are written. And here you say, you will eat what your neighbor ordered. So if you're sitting in a circle, you're going to eat whatever the neighbor ordered. Now, this may be a nightmare. So when you order, you have to really think, let me get something that everybody likes. Now, this is a foundation for collaboration. Then last minute changes. So as a family, you can all say, you know what, we're going to watch Home Alone 2, which sucks, by the way. So let's say you decide to watch that movie, and then last minute change would be to watch something else that was by the same actor. Now, this requires a little bit of, we spend in our house more time discussing what we will watch than actually watching, because building consensus is really hard. So kind of last minute changes are, are a great way to build strength. Excuse me. No discussion is really complete without we talking about resilience. So flexibility is, again, the fuel that runs the motor of resilience. So I love the Hemingway's quote here: "The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong at the broken places." Love that quote. What is it trying to tell you? That having interruptions in your life or having interruptions in your goal attainment is a basic bedrock of building resilience. But how you tolerate that break, how you tolerate that interruption, is the art of living well. Now, lastly, I love this show, as I was mentioning. This is House, and House has this co-doctor who is an oncologist, and House in one of the episodes very fondly says, by the way, those who don't know House is a brash, obnoxious, brilliant, incredibly effective doctor, and the show is about him going about in unconventional ways to solve a problem. And he, because of his brashness and rough around the edges look, he is not received well. So he has this quote. He says that my friend here, who's an oncologist, who tells his patients they are going to die, and they say thank you to him. And when I save their lives, they say nothing. So that's so telling, that if you keep your personal goals as a top priority, you're never going to build bonds with people in your life. So remember, higher goal trumps lower goal. Flexibility simply should be motivated by your desire to belong to a larger community, larger purpose. And hence you need to let go the less important goal. Finally, transcend. I love the idea of comparing ourselves to the Pop-Tart. We are not Pop-Tarts, because there is no ding sound at the end when we are done. So just keep that in mind. We are work in progress. We probably will continue to evolve, hopefully, let's pray, and until our last breath. But the idea there is always a better version of you waiting on the other side, and all you got to do is turn the corner. So be willing and patient to turn the corner. So in summary, as I mentioned, there is first strategy: unglue the head. You know, the ungluing the head strategy is build critical thinking skills. The second is unglue your heart. And the best way to do that is regulate and redirect emotions. Get hold of your emotions, control your emotions. And the last part, because executive function is nothing but motor practice, make sure you unglue your hands. That means shake up routines, practice, practice, practice. So with that, I am very happy to say that we are ending this webinar. I hope it was loads of fun. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. You can also send a comment. If you like the webinar, share with me, like ExQ, our website. And remember, flexibility is your relationship with your world. More flexible you are, more desirable companion in the universe you're going to be, because when you take life lightly, other people are going to feel that you're okay, and because you're okay, they're going to feel okay. So being okay is a vibe that you can send through being relaxed, being okay with your own mistakes, and accepting that life is not perfect, and it never will. What will be perfect is your response to it. So enjoy your time, and remember to have fun.